Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today, we are unpacking a highly sensitive, often radioactive question, one that sits right between internet conspiracy theories and strict institutional censorship. Do Jews control the media? We're going to explore the founding of Hollywood, the reality of corporate media influence, and how modern politics has completely flipped the script on media coverage of Israel. So if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button, because we are going straight into the deep end on this one.
It is a massive, highly fraught topic.
Right.
And to be absolutely clear right from the jump, our mission today is impartial analysis. We are looking at a video essay by Ken LaCourte, and we aren't here to endorse a viewpoint or take a political side.
Right, we are just the messengers here.
Exactly. Our goal is to simply analyze the arguments he presents just to see how he navigates this space. He's actively trying to find a middle ground between outright anti-Semitic bigotry, where people blame a global Jewish cabal for everything under the sun, and the stance of organizations like the Anti-Defamation League.
The ADL.
Right, the ADL, which argues that even asking if there's disproportionate influence is, in and of itself, an anti-Semitic trope.
And LaCourte kicks this off with a historical anecdote that perfectly illustrates just how untouchable this subject really is. We all know Marlon Brando.
Oh yeah, absolute Hollywood royalty.
The guy spent his entire life bucking the system and daring people to stop him. In 1973, he literally boycotted the Oscars. He sent Sacheen Littlefeather, a Native American activist, to reject his Best Actor award for The Godfather on live television.
Which, at the time, was an unthinkable breach of Hollywood etiquette. Nobody did that.
Exactly. He trashed the press, he insulted politicians, completely slammed his own industry, and his career barely registered a dent. He was completely Teflon.
He really was.
But years later, he crossed one specific line. He gave an interview where he claimed, and I'm quoting here, "Hollywood is run by Jews, it's owned by Jews," and he suggested they should have greater sensitivity to people who are suffering. And the backlash wasn't just fast, it was completely overwhelming.
Yeah, the guy who defied the Academy Awards on live television was suddenly forced to issue a highly publicized written apology through the Simon Wiesenthal Center.
Oh, wow.
Which is, one of the premier global human rights organizations dedicated to Holocaust remembrance. And he even had to go apologize to Jewish leaders in person.
In person. That is wild. But wait a second. Let me push back on the premise of the question itself. Because LaCourte points out that a 2015 poll showed 25% of people worldwide believe Jewish people have too much control over the media.
A quarter of the globe.
A quarter of the globe. How is that even possible if the topic is so heavily censored? It feels like the strict institutional censorship might actually be fueling the conspiracy theory rather than squashing it. If you can't talk about something, people immediately assume there's a secret to hide.
That is precisely the paradox LaCourte is addressing. He argues the antidote to a conspiracy theory isn't silencing the conversation. It's demanding smarter, more precise speech. Because right now, the turns of the question itself are completely broken.
Right.
If you ask, do Jews control the media?
Yeah.
You then have to actually define what Jewish means in this context, which turns out to be incredibly difficult.
And this is where my brain started tying itself in knots, because LaCourte really zeroes in on the theology versus the ethnicity, and it gets highly philosophical, especially with the whole atheism and God debate.
Oh, absolutely.
If we are evaluating this idea of a unified group controlling an industry, how do we even define Jewish here? Is it a religion, an ethnicity? As the source points out, what if your mom is Jewish, but you're an atheist who eats bacon and doesn't believe in God?
Exactly. And that makes analyzing this numerically almost impossible.
Think about the absolute paradox of atheism here. You can participate in cultural traditions, light the Hanukkah candles, but completely reject the existence of God. You can think the Torah is just an old book of fables, and yet you are still counted as Jewish.
It's a profound distinction, and it really highlights the unique nature of Jewish identity compared to other major worldviews. Think about Christianity or Islam. In those frameworks, theological belief is the absolute prerequisite for membership. You can't really be a practicing atheist Catholic.
Yeah, that makes no sense.
Exactly. If you don't believe in the divinity of Christ, you aren't Catholic. The theology is the core identifier. But with Judaism, the ethno-cultural ties are so deep and historically intertwined that atheism doesn't negate the identity.
Right.
You can entirely reject the concept of God and still be completely recognized and recognize yourself as Jewish.
And that completely shatters the logic of the conspiracy theory. If we are trying to measure the influence of a group, but the members of that group have completely opposing views on the fundamental nature of the universe.
Like the very existence of a creator.
Yes. How can anyone claim they are operating with a unified, secret agenda? You're lumping deeply orthodox religious believers who adhere to strict biblical law into the exact same demographic bucket as secular, atheist tech executives in California and trying to draw a straight line to media control. It's absurd.
It really is. LaCourt notes that Jewish people argue internally about this definition all the time. But even if we could perfectly define the demographic, we then run into the second broken word in that question, control.
Yeah, the word control implies this, like cartoonish reality. People imagine a smoke-filled room where a dozen guys in suits are pulling puppet strings and writing memos to dictate fake news.
A classic conspiracy trope.
Exactly. Trying to measure control in today's media landscape is like trying to catch water with a net. 50 years ago, we had 3 networks, but today we have a massive explosion of influencers, AI, and thousands of outlets.
The universe of information is practically infinite now.
It is. The pipe has completely burst. Podcasters, Substack writers, independent journalists, it is just not a closed loop anymore.
Which is true today. But if we rewind the clock, LaCourt argues that early Hollywood was a very different story.
Okay, how so?
Well, while modern media is highly fragmented, the foundational era of the entertainment industry was incredibly concentrated. And if you ask the historical question, did Jewish people control early Hollywood? LaCourt suggests the historical answer is a pretty solid yes.
But let's look at the why and the how, because it wasn't some sinister grand master plan. It was basically a survival mechanism.
Absolutely.
The founders of the major studios, Paramount, Universal, 20th Century Fox, MGM, Warner Brothers, they weren't legacy American aristocrats. They were Jewish immigrants.
Right. Many of them arrived absolutely penniless, fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe. They were outsiders locked out of traditional prestige American industries like banking or heavy manufacturing.
So they had to pivot.
Yeah, they gravitated toward a brand new, slightly disreputable business, moving pictures. They built an industry completely from scratch, and by the 1920s and 30s, they had turned silent films into a national obsession.
It's kind of like an immigrant group starting the very first tech hub before Silicon Valley was even a concept. You hire your friends, you build the infrastructure, and suddenly you've built a pipeline.
Success breeds infrastructure.
Yeah. If you're an outsider in a new country and you start a risky new business, who are you going to hire? You hire people from your neighborhood who speak your language. You build the talent agencies, the managers, the publicists.
The financiers, the whole network.
Exactly. You mentor people who share your background. And just through natural human networking, you have this massive foundation.
But here is the fascinating historical irony that LaCourt points out. You would assume that if a specific ethnic group built and controlled the major studios, they would use that massive cultural megaphone to flood the market with their own stories and perspectives, right?
That would be the logical assumption, yeah.
But they did the exact opposite.
Wait, really? They actively avoided it?
They actively avoided making overtly Jewish content. These early moguls were terrified of being seen as tribal or as un-American. Their primary psychological drive was to assimilate.
Oh, wow. They just wanted to fit in.
Exactly. They wanted to prove they belonged. So they used their studios to manufacture and sell the ultimate idealized American dream. They stayed away from Jewish characters, stripped actors of their Jewish-sounding names, and completely scrubbed their heritage from the screen.
That is wild.
Yeah, it wasn't until the 1960s and 70s that Hollywood felt secure enough to openly embrace Jewish identity in its art.
So they built the machine, but they essentially used it to broadcast a sterilized middle American fantasy just to survive the cultural climate of the time. But let me challenge LaCourt's timeline here.
Go for it.
Does this historical foundation equal modern control, especially now that tech giants like Amazon and Apple are taking over the old Hollywood machine?
That is exactly where LaCourt shifts his focus. He argues that while the centers of power are absolutely moving toward Silicon Valley, the legacy of that original pipeline, combined with cultural factors, still results in a massive overrepresentation of Jewish executives at the very top of modern media and tech companies.
He lists out a pretty heavy-hitting roster. We're talking Disney under Bob Iger, CBS controlled by Sherry Redstone, NBC run by Brian Roberts, CNN under David Zaslav, Meta led by Mark Zuckerberg, and the New York Times, which has been run by the Sulzberger family since 1896.
Now, LaCourt acknowledges this isn't a peer-reviewed sociological data set, But he argues that if you just look at the landscape of executive leadership, the representation far exceeds the roughly 2% of the United States population that identifies as Jewish.
But we have to break that list down because lumping all those people together ignores how different their power structures really are.
And you mean?
Well, the Sulzberger family, maintaining a multi-generational legacy newspaper dynasty, operates entirely differently than Mark Zuckerberg, a Harvard dropout who coded a social network in his dorm room. The mechanisms of how they got their power are totally unrelated. So why do we see this demographic trend across both legacy media and new tech?
LaCourte attributes it to culture, not conspiracy.
Okay.
He highlights a deep generational emphasis on education, literacy, and professional excellence. I mean, he points out a staggering statistic. Jewish individuals have captured roughly 22% of all Nobel Prizes ever awarded.
That is unbelievable. 22%.
Right. When you combine that immense cultural drive for educational achievement with the natural human networking we talked about earlier, you get a clear result in highly competitive fields.
It's what he calls gatekeeping without a gate. He uses a great anecdote about a reporter he worked with who would constantly recruit from her USC alma mater whenever a job opened up.
She wasn't trying to lock out other universities.
Right. She just wanted to help her own community and pull from a network she trusted. There's nothing malicious about it. But if the same kind of people keep hiring the same kind of people over decades, an industry naturally narrows. It creates an ideological and demographic bubble.
And that brings us to the core of the entire analysis. If this bubble exists, and there is an overrepresentation at the top, how does that actually translate into the news and entertainment you consume?
Because, as we established, there is no secret memo dictating the daily narrative.
Right. And LaCourte explains this mechanism brilliantly, using his own time working at Fox News under Rupert Murdoch. Now, at his peak, Murdoch owned over 200 media entities globally.
That is a massive empire.
So did Rupert Murdoch sit at a giant mahogany desk, approving every single script, headline, and article across 200 companies on 5 continents?
Of course not. It's physically impossible. Thousands of independent editorial decisions are being made every single hour by thousands of different employees.
But those employees are highly motivated to keep their jobs. And that is where soft influence comes in. LaCourte gives a specific example. In the early 2000s, Rupert Murdoch was aggressively trying to expand his satellite television business into China.
Oh, I see where this is going.
He was investing heavily and trying to court favor with the Chinese government.
Nobody needs to send a memo saying, make the company look good. If you're an editor and you know your boss is investing heavily in China, you're not going to pitch a story that hurts that investment. You just naturally figure out what the boss cares about.
That is the perfect anatomy of corporate influence.
Yeah, you just self-censor. You don't run an investigative piece on labor camps if the boss is trying to win over the government.
It almost never comes from direct, tyrannical orders. It trickles down through subtle signals about who's in charge, what their unspoken priorities are, and what kind of coverage gets rewarded versus what gets you marginalized.
Okay, so if we take that exact psychological mechanism of soft influence and apply it to an overrepresentation of Jewish executives and editors, what does LaCourte say the actual impact is on the content?
He points to a few areas, starting with entertainment. LaCourte notes a personal observation that devout Christians are frequently portrayed negatively in Hollywood productions.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they are often written as hypocrites, closeted bigots, or uneducated rubes. While that's difficult to quantify with hard data, he argues it's a visible cultural trend within the industry's writing rooms.
Okay, but what about the news side? How does this soft influence actually shape political reality?
To understand that, we have to look at the voting demographics. American Jews vote overwhelmingly for the Democratic Party.
How overwhelming?
In the 2020 election, LaCourte notes that roughly 70% of Jewish voters went for Joe Biden. They are historically one of the most reliable voter blocs for the political left.
So logically, if you have a media industry with disproportionate leadership and editorial presence from a specific demographic, and 70% of that demographic views the world through a left-leaning political lens, the center of gravity in those newsrooms is naturally going to pull to the left.
It's that USC alumni network effect again.
Right. You hire people who fundamentally see the world the way you do, and the coverage reflects that shared worldview.
Precisely. But here is where LaCourte's analysis takes a fascinating, deeply counterintuitive turn, specifically regarding the coverage of Israel. This is a phenomenon he calls the big flip.
This is where my brain broke a little bit. Because if we are talking about media bias, Historically, the U.S. media was the biggest cheerleader for Israel on the global stage.
It absolutely was. For
Yep.
decades, Israel was framed in the American press as a scrappy, Western-style democracy fighting for survival, completely surrounded by hostile, authoritarian neighbors.
Yeah, that was a standard narrative.
And LaCourte points out that after September 11th, when Americans watched Islamic extremists attack New York and Washington, that sympathetic framing hardened significantly. The American public and the press deeply related to a nation dealing with constant terrorism.
But LaCourte shows how that script has completely inverted in recent years, and the irony of where the criticism is coming from is just staggering.
It really is an incredible shift. LaCourte observes that the legacy mainstream media institutions, places like the New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, which historically have higher numbers of Jewish executives and editors, have become increasingly, and sometimes fiercely, critical of Israel.
Wow.
Yeah, some of the absolute toughest scrutiny and condemnation of the Israeli government is coming from inside those very institutions, often written and produced by Jewish reporters themselves.
Meanwhile, if you look at the media outlets with the least amount of Jewish leadership, places like Fox News, conservative talk radio, and the broader right-wing populist media sphere, they have become full-throated, uncompromising defenders of Israel.
Which raises the ultimate question. How did these traditional alliances completely flip upside down?
Yeah, how does that even happen?
LaCourte argues that the answer is the sheer, overpowering gravity of modern American politics. In today's culture war, your political ideology simply overpowers your ethnic or religious background.
So you're saying that in today's culture war, the political jersey you wear completely overpowers your ethnic or religious background. Politics trumps identity.
According to LaCourte's analysis, yes. The liberal media class today is deeply shaped by modern progressive ideological frameworks.
It's like social justice movements.
Exactly. We're talking about academic theories regarding race, colonialism, power dynamics, the oppressor versus the oppressed, and global social justice. And those progressive frameworks do not give Israel a pass just because of historical sympathy.
Right, they view it through a completely different lens now.
In fact, those frameworks place Israel under a much harsher, highly critical lens as a powerful, Western-backed state.
And at the exact same time, the populist right, a demographic that may have zero personal, ethnic, or religious connection to Jewish people whatsoever, has fully embraced Israel.
Yes. They view it as the ultimate symbol of Western values, nationalism, and strong borders under attack from radical forces.
The tribalism of American politics has become the strongest force in the room. It has essentially overridden whatever soft influence Jewish identity might have traditionally exerted on media narratives.
The political narrative is now driving the bus. And LaCourte ends his video with a fascinating, almost paradoxical conclusion about how this left-leaning bias actually played out in the real world.
Right. He argues that the left-leaning media completely miscalculated. By abandoning traditional objectivity to act as cheerleaders for progressive causes, they eroded public trust.
And by pushing so hard in one direction, they inadvertently fueled the populist backlash that helped elect Donald Trump twice.
It's a bold, highly debatable claim, but it perfectly synthesizes the entire journey of LaCourte's argument. We started this conversation looking at a radioactive taboo question that historically gets people canceled or forces them into public apologies.
And what did we find? We discovered that media influence isn't about secret religious cabals or shadowy puppet masters.
There are no smoke-filled rooms.
None. It's about natural human networking, the undeniable realities of corporate self-preservation and soft influence, and ultimately, the overpowering, gravity-like force of modern American politics.
A force so strong, it has the power to take historical alliances, strip away religious and ethnic identities, and flip the entire media landscape completely upside down.
It really is incredible how a question that starts steeped in 20th century prejudice actually just leads us straight into the mechanics of corporate workplace culture and modern political tribalism.
But before we wrap up, LaCourte briefly mentioned the AI boom expanding the media universe, which leaves me with a thought I really can't shake.
Oh, what's that?
If political alignment has now superseded human identity in shaping the news, what happens next? As AI begins to write our articles and curate our feeds, an entity with zero ethnicity or religion, but trained by humans with very distinct political biases who will be controlling the media then. Something to think about next time you scroll.